Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with a tutorial. This is going to be a little different from previous tutorials. I tend to create tutorials in VFX software in Blender, the 3D model making and animation software. This is going to be a tutorial in Linux Multimedia Studio. My real occupation is a music teacher. I'm an instrumental music teacher in New York State. And so this is more in line with my real work than the 3D effects stuff, which is really just a hobby. I converted over to open source and free software a number of years ago, probably about 10 years ago or more, with everything that I use. So that's not just in the interest of my VFX hobby, but also with my music software. And before that, I was using some proprietary, relatively expensive software applications like Finale and Sibelius for notation. And I was using Reason for MIDI editing and sequencing, and also Vegas Video and some of those, Sony products. And I've put all of that aside and I've moved it exclusively over to open source. So today we're going to look at Linux Multimedia Studio, kind of in that vein. Now before I go ahead with this, I just want to point out that what we're going to do here actually can be applied using some free sound fonts with any kind of MIDI software. So if you have a proprietary package like Cakewalk or Sonar, or something like that, you can use the same techniques in there with your free sound fonts to get some good sounds. Let's take a look at a few things though first. I just want to point out that the MIDI the MIDI file that we're going to use I got here at midiworld.com on the Tchaikovsky page. We're using Romeo and Juliet, and the idea here is that we wanted to use something that is unmistakable, that you would recognize and would be able to relate to real recordings that you've heard of the piece before, because the idea here is that we're shooting for realism with free sound fonts. So that's where I got the MIDI file. I'm not sure who generated it. It doesn't say on here, I don't think. But anyway, you can go there and whatever attribution is there, you can see it. Also, you're going to need some sound fonts. So this is a website, newgrounds.com, with a forum in it. And this was posted a long time ago, back in 2010. An individual here had put together a package, a grouping in multiple files of sound fonts, free sound fonts that he'd collected, he or she, I'm not sure who this person is, over the years. And they're available here, and all of these links still work, and I think they've even been updated a little bit in recent years. So you can download these. A lot of the sound fonts that are in there are ones that you probably already have used if you use sound fonts. These are pretty widely used and shared free open source sound fonts. There are individual sound fonts in there for individual instruments, and there are also sound fonts in there that are in groupings, and there are even some general MIDI sound fonts in there as well. In addition to that, we're going to need to have a general MIDI sound font, and probably one of the better ones is found with the MuseScore application. It is called, let me see if I can find it here, it's called the Fluid R3 General MIDI sound font. MuseScore also comes with this one here, Tim General MIDI 6 megabyte sound font. The Fluid R3 is the better one, and that's the one that is loaded by default inside of MuseScore. MuseScore is a notation application that I have gone to in place of Finale, which is what I used to use before. Now, what Finale and Sibelius and Notion and some of these other proprietary software packages offer is not only very clean notation, but also some very good sampled sound platforms from which you can play your compositions back with, some acceptably better quality sounds rather than just a general MIDI output. I don't care so much about those capabilities because I've discovered over the years that the best way to get the best sound is to export all of your data as a Midi file into an application like what we're going to do today, into a Midi sequencer, and really working it on that file and making a good project with good effects and getting a result that way. So I've abandoned those proprietary platforms and moved over to MuseScore because MuseScore does all of the notation things that you could ever want. And it also has a fairly acceptable general MIDI sound font output. So you can get that sound font there, download MuseScore for your notation, save yourself those subscription fees and those upgrade fees. The other thing I want to point to here is the actual project, the actual application we're using. Linux Multimedia Studio is found here at this website, LMMS.io. And you can download it. It's multi-platform. I am running on Linux Ubuntu Studio, which is an XFCE-based desktop environment. I, again, abandoned all proprietary platforms and have gone completely to open source, which includes the OS that I'm using as well. So you can download it here, multi-platform download. This sequencer is a lot more geared toward electronic music creation, beat making, and such things as that. It is not really intended to create orchestration like what we're doing, but it can do it, and it's actually very, very easy to use. Now there's another application that's pretty popular. This is really only for Linux, and it's kind of like a cakewalk or Sonar, and it's a digital audio workstation called Qtractor. This is specifically for Linux, so if you're on a Windows or on a Mac, you wouldn't be able to use this, I don't believe. But this is more traditional in terms of orchestration types MIDI sequencing, and it also does audio file sequencing as well. So this is another alternative to that. The problem with Qtractor, as with a lot of the proprietary platforms, is that it can be very confusing trying to patch your instruments into outputs and inputs, and then also rendering down and recording down to a final track. Very confusing process. Whereas with Linux Multimedia Studio, a lot of that stuff is automated, and you don't really need to concern yourself with the back end. You can just merely apply an effect to a channel, and it applies properly without you having to think about where to patch things together. So let's take a look at Linux Multimedia Studio here very quickly. Just want to make sure that we covered everything. One more thing I want to point to is with respect to these sound fonts. Why use sound fonts? Well, you can buy proprietary sounds that are of a very high quality. This is one company, East West, which puts out very, very well-known, widely used professional grade sound libraries. These are very big files that have samples and multiple velocities recorded by professional musicians. Very good libraries. And if you know what you're doing, you can make this sound like a real group, real orchestration or a real symphonic environment. However, it costs an arm and a leg. So this is the alternative to what we're doing. Now, can you make free sound fonts sound as good as this? Well, not really, but I'm going to show you that we can get pretty close, but you have to be kind of clever. And I also want to say that in order to make these great libraries really sound realistic, you have to go through a lot of the steps that we're going to look at today anyway. There is a myth out there that if you purchase these libraries and just use them, apply these sounds to your projects, that everything will automatically sound great. And it doesn't really work that way. You need to layer articulations, much like what we're going to do, even with these very expensive proprietary packages. So, don't believe the myth out there that the better the samples that you have or the more you paid for them, the better off you are. The quality of your work is going to be in the way that you sequence it. So let's move on here with that to Linux Multimedia Studio. This is an untitled project. The first thing that you want to do is you're going to want to go to the settings, and under the folders you want to designate a default sound font file, and I have designated that Fluid R3 general MIDI sound font that comes with MuseScore, and this is what you want to have in there, because when you load in a MIDI file it needs to go to a sound font in order to put the instruments in the right place. So let me show you what I mean by that. By default we have a few different instruments here and a beat bassline section here. We don't need any of this, so we're just going to get rid of it. Click on the gear and hit remove. Remove this track. What we're going to do is we're going to import our MIDI file. So go to the desktop, and here's our MIDI file, and as it imports, what it's going to do is it's going to designate an instrument to each one of these tracks. And you can see that it's not named properly. It's named after the sound font itself, but if we click in onto the instrument, you'll see that it has the proper, because this MIDI file is well made, it has a proper instrument applied to it. Slow strings. You can hear what that sounds like. Now this brings me to a few important points. In order for this to work, you need to have a few things. You need to have a good music score. Okay, so your music needs to be well written. If you've composed garbage, you really aren't going to be able to make it sound good later on. So you have to compose good music to start with. We're using a classical romantic piece here by a legendary composer, so that's covered. The second thing you need is you need to have a good MIDI performance. This MIDI performance is very, very good, very well done, whoever did it. I can tell that it was entered by playing it into a keyboard, because the velocity settings vary on the key depressions, and there's quite a few controllers tied to the MIDI data. So that's the second thing, good MIDI performance. The third thing you need to have some good sound samples. We've got that covered in a minute. We'll look at those in a minute. And then you also need to have good mixing settings, and that's really the bulk of what this tutorial is going to be about, is the MIDI settings, the mixing settings themselves. And that includes effects like equalization, compression, and reverb. Reverb being the biggest issue. So anyway, we have this default sound font. Now I'm going to play this back, and you can hear what this sounds like with our default general MIDI sound font. And again, this is one of the better sound fonts out there that's a general MIDI sound font. Listen carefully. So that would be the output that you would get in MuseScore. There would be a reverb effect on that too that's part of the MuseScore sequencer, but this is really what the sound font is. It's pretty generic, not very good, at least not very realistic. It's real enough that you can identify what the instruments are, which is part of the goal in MuseScore, just to hear kind of what it would sound like and get a general idea, some instant feedback. Let's go ahead to another section here where there's a little bit more going on. Let's see here. Maybe slide down here a little bit. So you hear what's going on here. It's not very good quality, even though we have instruments on there that are otherwise considered pretty good general MIDI instruments. What we need to do is we're going to change each and every one of these instruments to an individual layer sound font that will work for what we want. Additionally to that, we're going to duplicate a bunch of these and load in multiple layers so that we have multiple articulations for that instrument. I already have a file put together. I'm going to open that here very quickly, and this is we'll discard that. So as this loads in, this is the final project that we were working with, and I'm going to break it down for you, help you understand how this is constructed together. So right away, if you look at the top, you can see that we have, for that one string sound, there was one channel there. We actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different sound fonts in there, and they're not all enabled all the time. So what you do is you start with one sound font, like this one here. I replaced the high string sound with this cadenza violin sound font from that package. And I also want to show you something else. I have, through the years, organized my sound fonts into, let me go back here. Jump up one, sound samples, into groupings and into additional sound fonts that have compiled the original sound fonts together. So for example, if I want to put a brass sound in there, I've put all of my favored trumpet sound fonts into one. So I can load in my one new sound font. It's got sound samples from all those other ones. That's a totally different tutorial. We're not going to get into that. And you don't need to do this. It's just the way I have it organized. So as I load things in here, you'll notice they don't look quite like what you see in that package. They're all the same sounds, but I have compiled these myself over the years into single sound fonts. So anyway, I loaded in this cadenza violin, which is a solo violin. It sounds like this. And actually what I should do is I should turn off all of my effects so you can hear exactly what's going on. If I turn off all of my reverb, compression, and equalization, you can hear the sound. So you hear that it sounds like it's a pretty good sample of an individual violin. Now, it doesn't sound terribly realistic without the reverb and effects on it, but it does sound a lot better than what we would have otherwise with a general MIDI sound font. Now on top of that single violin, I added another layer. That's this one here, which is a slow string sound, and then on top of that I added another one, which is actually a violin tremolo, and I have the gain turned way down. It's to give that kind of shimmery sound that you get with high strings, particularly in the upper register. Now that brings me to another point, is that you want to use what sounds right. You don't necessarily need to use what sounds or what is labeled properly. We're just making a general violin sound here, but it just so happens that this tremolo, layered in with a bunch of other sounds, gets us to the right sound that we want. Okay, and then also I have another one on here, which is a detached articulation. That'll be for the fast runs. You notice here on the slow parts it's not playing. I've deleted that MIDI data. And then in addition to that, I added a pizzicato sound. It's actually a marcato sound that sounds like a pizzicato, and it sounds even better than the pizzicato sound fonts that I have. See, I think that intends to be a real marcato sound, but it sounds an awful lot like plucking, and with the effects put on it, it sounds exactly like what we want. So there it is, and those are all the violins. Now I did the same thing for the viola, for the cello and bass. Down here on the flute, there's a flute sound from that package. Here's an oboe sound. Another thing is that you want to use sounds that have a very diverse kind of tone with their equalization and frequency. So this has a lot more high frequency edge. When you have diversity in your sounds, it sounds more realistic. Clarinet. This isn't the best clarinet out of that group. I actually had another one that was a lot better, but the really good one had a flaw in that once it looped, it had this kind of whooshing sound at the very tail of the sound. So ultimately I couldn't use it, but this one works well enough. And with everything grouped together in the effects, it'll sound good. Horns. For the horns, I have multiple layers again. So here's the first layer, horn section. which is pretty aggressive. It only has one velocity setting. The better sound fonts will have multiple velocity settings so that when you hit the key hard, it'll give you one set of samples, and if you hit the key light, it'll give you another set of samples. So this only has one. So this is good for loud horn playing. You'll notice that there's no data in here on the soft parts. For the staccato, the one down here, I've got another one. I think this might be from the SquidFont SoundFont package in that group. And you'll notice that when we have the loud portions, I have that doubled up with my horn, aggressive horn sound up here. For the soft one, I have this sound font loaded in. It is actually a trombone, a legato trombone. And I discovered that with the effects applied to it later on, this actually sounds more like a horn than it does a trombone. So again, it doesn't matter what it's labeled. What matters is what it sounds like. That's ultimately what you want to pay attention to. Let's see what else we have here. Harp. I think this is actually from one of the general MIDI packages. It might even be from the Fluid General MIDI with the effects on it. That one sounds fine. Here's a timpani sound. Again, I think that might be a general MIDI one too. For the cymbals, I got a little bit of flack from one of my viewers here on my example. Didn't like my cymbals, so I actually changed them a little bit. Here's a cymbal that we're using. And actually, probably the better way is to solo it, and we can hear it play back. Here's the original cymbal that I had. It's a suspended cymbal sound. And the complaint was that it wasn't a crash cymbal sound. And the real problem actually is that it doesn't have a choke on it. And in this piece, the crash cymbals mostly are played with a choke. That is, that they're crashed and then the sound is abruptly stopped against the shoulders, or they are pocketed together. I added another sound font on here that does have a bit more of a choke to it, and this is what I came up with. So they're kind of mixed together. To split the difference a little bit. And you can layer up multiple sounds to get to your better end result. So I did change that one. Let's see down here for bassoon. Pretty good solo sound font. English horn has a little bit more of a alto tone than the oboe, so you want to make sure you use a separate sound font for the English horn from an oboe. Don't use the same one. Trumpets, you can see I've got 4 different sounds here. I've got one here, legato tone. This is only used for one spot in the whole MIDI file that I wanted to get a particular tone in, and that's this sound here. And that by itself doesn't sound very appealing, but when it's put together with the other sound fonts at that point, it sounds nice. Over here I've got another one, staccato, which actually sounds more like a horn staccato, but it's good for the articulation on the loud passages. Here's another articulation, trumpet forte piano. And again, any one of these doesn't sound necessarily great, but when we put them together, they do fit pretty well. So this is used for the beginning articulation, and then it gets quiet after that. And then for the trumpet legato sound, this is actually a pretty good sound font in and of itself. And I believe it actually has more than one velocity layer. So if you hit it heavy, you get one kind of sound. If you hit it light, it's a different set of samples, so it matches more of a light playing. I find that the brass instruments are the hardest ones to sequence because they sound so different when they're played soft versus when they're played very loudly. So that's the one where you're going to want to have a lot of different layers, and you're going to want to try to find sound fonts that have multiple velocity settings. The strings probably next, although the woodwinds, some of the woodwinds do sound very different at various volumes, particularly the double reeds. So multiple velocity settings, multiple layers of articulation. Down here for the trombone, same kind of thing. I've got one for the legato trombone sound, one for staccato. I've got one down here, I call it trombone deep. It's actually a bass trombone. And in the lower register, it gets really buzzy, and that's good for the loud playing and the deep playing. Down here for tuba, I've got quite a few samples as well. I've got one for the general tuba tone. I've got another one for staccato. And I've got one for kind of a gritty sound. It's actually the same bass trombone sound that I had before. So on the really heavy low notes, this makes a nice tone. And then for one spot, I have another instance of the tuba solo that I added to fix one particular note later on. So this only gets used one time. And that's pretty much it. Those are all the sounds that we're using for this. So this is the name of the game. You have to load in layers of articulation and then enable and disable the various parts so that when you have the specific articulation you're looking for, like right here we have string pizzicato. If I go back here, let's play from this part. This is without effects. No effects in here at all. And then we have pizzicato. So that's what the patch change did for us. We add in that layer, and we get the articulation change. Okay, let's take a look at what it sounds like when everything's full out. We got everything playing here. Let's find a spot, like right over here. So this is everything. This is full big orchestration. This is without any effects. Okay, so you can see there what it sounds like without any effects on it. And already it's a lot better than that general MIDI sound font, that basic one, that single file that was controlling all of our different instruments. So you can see what all that layering gets us. Now it still isn't realistic. It still sounds very electronic, but it's a lot closer to where we want to be. So here comes the next phase. The next thing we need to do is we need to set some effects. We need to organize. Now on each of these instruments I designated a specific channel, an effects channel. So all the strings are on channel 1. All of the woodwinds, if I find a woodwind down here, are on channel 2. All of the brass are on channel 3. And then all of the both of the percussion parts are on channel 4. Let's go to the mixer. So each one of these channels here contains different sections of the orchestra. Now, the biggest problem that I have found in mixing sound fonts, free sound fonts in the past, is that you can't really quite add a reverb effect such that it makes it sound a lot better. It really just ends up sounding like cheap sound or free sound fonts with reverb. We want them to sound, we want the reverb to improve the sound, not degrade it more. And that's hard to do. Now, I discovered a bit of a method here, which isn't completely foreign to MIDI sequencing techniques on proprietary software with very good sound samples. And I just tried to apply it here with our free samples. And that is to use multiple layers of reverb. And you got to be very careful not to get carried away on this. You want to use only the least amount that you can in order to get the effect. But the idea is that we're going to apply a local reverb effect that will cause our instruments to sound like they are in a specific place within the room, but they are relatively devoid of any kind of reverb tail, any kind of fall off. So we're just using the diffusion and the reflection settings of a reverb effect in order to place them into a place inside the room. Then, when we go to the master channel, the final mix, we add a secondary reverb for everything that applies the appropriate tail and fall off for all of the instruments together. So they sound like the instruments are in a different place in the room, but they all sound like they're in the same room, which is a lot more realistic. Now, part of what this does, adding this diffusion kind of reverb on the sections, is it hides and covers up the less desired articulation sounds of the sound fonts, those electronic attacks and releases. If we can make it sound like it's inside of a room, it would take away some of those less desired sounds and artifacts. You think of it like this. I once saw a movie, Castaway, with Tom Hanks, and in that movie they do a lot of what's called automatic dialogue replacement. Because the movie takes place outside, there's a bunch of outside nature kinds of sounds getting in the way of the recording. The sound of the ocean, the sound of the wind. So they record all of the dialogue and only the sound effects that they want in a studio. And then they mix those together to get the final result. You don't really hear any sound that was recorded on the day. Now, one problem is that they want to try to make it sound like they are in the real location. Now, there's a scene in there where Tom Hanks is yelling down the beach, and the camera perspective is far away from the actor, so it should sound like he's yelling from a long ways away. So what they did is they recorded him dry in a studio, and then they took the recording with a speaker system outside into the parking lot. They set another microphone up about 50 yards away to 100 yards away, and they played back that sound and re-recorded it outside. So they re-recorded in a controlled exterior environment to emulate the not-so-controlled exterior environment, devoid of all of the waves crashing and the wind and everything. And we're kind of trying to do the same thing here. We're going to create an environment just around the sections that make them sound like they're in a specific place in the room. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. Now, I found that of the onboard reverb effects, the one that does this best is Freeverb. So you can search for that. You click on Add an Effect. You can type in FRE. You'll see here Freeverb version 3. And I added this in here, and I'll turn it on. I put an instance in here for percussion, put in one for brass, I put in one for woodwinds, and I put in one for strings. Now, they all have different settings. Let me open these up very quickly. So here is 4. Here is 3 for brass. Here is channel 2 for woodwinds. Here's channel 1 for strings. Let's compare very quickly what's going on here. So for the strings, I have the room size set relatively low because the strings would be kind of on the front edge of the stage. There's a lot more of them closer to the front edge of the stage, so you'd be hearing a lot more of the dry, real articulation from those instruments. I set the wet level back from the other ones and the dry level up, and these are also kind of comparable in ratio. You want to try to keep it that way. It helps out a lot with the realism and without getting a lot of extra overlap in sound. I set the dampening all the way up on all of these instances, and then I change the width, and this kind of has to do with the size of the room and what it would sound like, particularly with relation to the left and right stereo channels. So the width is set kind of low on this because there's so many of them and they're so close to the microphone, it wouldn't sound like a wide kind of scope. So I set this up for the strings, then I did one for the woodwinds, which has a room that sounds a little bit bigger because they're a little bit deeper into the group. They're a few rows back in the center. The wet level is a little higher. The dry level is a little bit lower. The dampening is all the way up, so there's very little fall off. And the width is a little bit higher too. Then for the brass section, I set the room size way up. The brass sounds, again, are a little bit more difficult to get perfect because of the large velocity changes in the real instruments. So we want to hide them a little bit more. So I have the room size way up. I have the wet level kind of back in the middle, balance out with the dry level. Again, the dampening is all the way up, and the width is a little bit wider too. And then finally with the percussion, I have the room size back kind of between the brass and the woodwinds. Even though they would be in the back row, I found that if I have the room size settings way up too high and the wet level up way too high, it gets really muffled and we can't hear the articulation of the percussion instruments. So you want to play this by ear. There's no specific logic to it. It's based on what sounds best. Okay, so I set up all of this initial reverb by section, and this is what it sounds like. We'll try to find that same spot again where everything's happening full out. Make sure everything else is turned off. We have our reverb effect on, and let's see here, place where everybody's playing full out nice and big. You can hear that sounds a lot better right away. Okay, so we're getting closer, we're getting there. Next thing we want to do is we want to deal with the final output, the master mix channel. So if we come over here to the master output, we're going to add a simple compressor. This is just going to help, and I use the default settings on this one. This will help to balance out the quiet parts with the louder parts. It'll bring the quiet parts up a little bit, and it will compress the louder parts down so they kind of normalize a little bit better. This is, you can give or take this. This is a little bit more artificial, like if you're doing a movie score or a film score, you'd want to have compression. If you're doing more of something that's emulating a concert performance, you probably wouldn't want this so much because you wouldn't have compression in a live full orchestra 2-mic stereo recording. You would things that are quiet would really be pretty quiet. Things that are loud would be at the peak. So anyway, I put a little bit of compression on there. Then the next thing I did is I added on another reverb. Now I found that this one, the calf reverb, and that's what the output looks like, does better with the tail and the fall off than the freeverb. So I use this one for the finish. And I set the room size up about to here. The dry amount is a little bit higher because we don't want to add a lot of wet sound to something that already has a lot of wet sound. So it's balanced out in ratio here. Dry to wet, a little bit more dry than wet. Now I set the diffusion up high and I set up a little bit of pre-delay, so it does sound like the mics are set back a little bit further yet from what that initial reverb is. And then the decay time is not very high either. We just want to get a little bit of fall off, a little bit of decay. So this is what the output sounds like with just that reverb effect on it. Find the same spot here again. and we're getting a lot closer. Okay, still not there. It sounds pretty muddy at this point, so we need to get a little bit more of a brighter tone. Real live recordings tend to have a bit more of a brighter tone to them, and we can solve that with some equalization. So I put on just a very simple 4-band EQ. This is what the controls look like. You can find that one here by clicking on Add, put in EQ, and I use this one right here, 4-band parametric equalizer. And this is it. Now what I did is I turned up the bass a little bit. I left the tertiary frequencies, kind of those baritone frequencies, alone. I turned back kind of these alto frequencies to get rid of that middle, put a little bit of a scoop in there on the middle frequencies, and then I turned up twice as high on the high frequencies as the bass. So we're boosting the bass a bit, we're boosting the high frequencies, we're pulling back on the mids, we're leaving kind of those lower mid frequencies alone, okay? And this is what we end up with. So same spot, and then we'll look to the magic pixie dust thing here in a minute, the one thing that's going to make it sound really nice. So one more time, this is what it sounds like with the frequency changes and the equalization. Okay, and that sounds really good. Okay, we're almost there. Now, through the years, I have found that no matter what I did, given all of these, effects and tricks that I'm showing you, I was never able to make my SoundFont rendered recording sound as if it filled the entire spectrum of the a waveform. That it kind of sounded like this. Like if this is the stage, this whole desktop screen here is the stage, it would sound like my orchestra was right here. It was just right here, kind of in the middle, and it didn't really span the whole scope stereoscopically. So, I kind of resigned myself to the fact that there was no way to get there without some kind of professional tools in order to do that, or some higher bitrate samples like what you can get with the proprietary sample libraries after paying an arm and a leg for them. And then I came upon this one little effect. I just ran into this about a month ago. This was just brand new to me. Uh-oh. I think we may have had a crash here. Give me a second. Close that out. There we go. Nope, just got docked. Okay, take a look here. There is one more effect down here. It's called the Stereo Enhancer Effect. Let me click on Add Effect here. If I put in stereo, I can't remember how I ran across this, but I just saw it there. And I thought, what is that thing? So I clicked on it, and I applied it to a solo instrument. And let me just show you what it does real quick here. I don't really know exactly what it does. The controls are really laughable. If I click on this is the control. It's just one knob, and it says wide. And I think what it's referring to is how far away in the left and right channel, how differentiated your stereo is going to sound. And that's exactly what I've been looking for. I wanted to make it sound like my recording is as wide a scope as possible in the left and right channels, that all of my frequency changes that I've made with my reverb and my EQ are heard all the way from left to right. Hang on, let me undo what I just did there. All the way from left to right. And this is what it sounds like. I have it set all the way up fully wide, by the way, so it's all the way as high as it can go. And we'll find that same spot. I think that sounds absolutely amazing. I'm not really sure what it does. I assume that it's doing a few things. It's probably changing some equalization settings. It's probably dealing with some pitch control to differentiate the left and the right channel a little bit. And then obviously one thing that it's addressing is the pan. So it's setting the widest pan between the left and right stereo output that it can set. And that's pretty much it right there. So that on top of setting our levels in our mixing channels, that's how we get to where we want to be. So just to recap what we've done. You want to have a good composition to start with. Make sure the music is well written. You need to have a good MIDI performance. And part of what makes a good MIDI performance is the errors in it, meaning that not every single note is perfectly quantized in time, that some performance is a little bit ahead of some other performance, that the velocity settings are changing. It's as if it's played by a human. Okay, that's what you want to have. So good MIDI performance is the second thing. You need to have some good sound samples. They make, for the articulations that they're being used for, they sound good enough for those specific roles. So you need to have some good sound samples. One single sound font won't cut it most of the time. You're going to need to use multiple layers. That some of them have to have more than one velocity setting. That doesn't mean that they can't be free. It just means that they have to be good. Okay, they have to be as good as you can get, and then you mix and match in order to get the final result. The next thing you need to have is you need to have good mixing settings, and that's what we just went over here. And then in the end, you have a better result when you get down to it. So anyway, that's what I've discovered. It's what I've found over the years, and this is how I'm able to make a relatively good sounding score rendering with free stuff, and you can do it too. I am convinced that if I spent enough time on this, there's probably only about 2 hours worth of muddling around with instruments, channel settings, MIDI data changes, and then effects. Only about 2 hours worth of playing around in LMMS in order to get it to where it's at right now. If I spent more time than that on it, if this was a serious project for like an independent film or a student film or something like that, I think I could get this to where in the context of a film, you might not know or realize or care that it's electronic. You may just kind of assume that it's a real kind of instrumentation going on in the background. So anyway, the quality is determined by the amount of time and the detail that you put into it. I guess that's my preaching point to you. So anyway, good luck with this, and I hope you find this useful, and I wish all of you happy mixing, editing, and rendering.